And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome to Open Connection. I'm your host, Robert Pictou. For thousands of years, indigenous traders followed well-trodden grease trails, usually the easiest routes across plateaus, highlands, and over challenging mountains far into the western interior, backpacking heavy boxes of Ooligan grease, held in place by cedar rope trump lines attached to headbands. Trade in Ooligan grease created a rich, vibrant economy of good exchange. On today's Open Connection, we open our archives to bring you this story from 1989.
The waters off the north coast of BC provide a veritable sea of riches for the people of the province. Every year, millions of dollars worth of aquatic life is harvested from the dark waters in various fisheries. Salmon provides the bulk of that wealth, but the smaller fisheries, for halibut, herring, and crab, are also very lucrative. And every year there's another type of fish that returns to our coastline, and it too is the target of a commercial fishery, albeit a small fishery. But to the people who harvest it, the Ooligan run is every bit as important and vital as the big money-making salmon fishery. Every year around Easter time, the small, smelt-like Ooligan return by the millions to spawn in the coastal rivers. The return is marked by the groups of sea lions and by the thousands of seagulls that gather by the rivers to feast on the Ooligan. And every year, the coastal Indians of BC also travel to the river estuaries to catch the Ooligan. The oil-rich fish is an integral part of their yearly diet. It can be dried or smoked or fried for consumption, or the Ooligan can be rendered down for their oil, which is highly prized by the natives as a food supplement, as a trade commodity, and even as a cure for the common cold. For the Haisla people of Kitimat village, the return of the Ooligan is an essential part of their cultural heritage. Kitimat village faces onto the waters of the Douglas Channel. Word of the first returns of the Ooligan heralds the arrival of spring and the imminent beginning of the first fishery of the season after the long winter months.
You can almost equate the return of the Ooligan to the rites of summer in the United States, where the whole country goes wild over the baseball game. It's rather more important to us than a baseball game, given that it's the source of a lot of the nutrition in this community that comes from the Ooligan, the grease, the smoked Ooligan, and the fact that we trade it up and down the coast for other foodstuffs that are not available in our area.
Perched on the shoreline at the mouth of the Camano River is a small seasonal fish camp, one of several in the area. The Haisla travel 4 hours by boat from Kitimat village to reach the fish camps. It's here where they catch the Ooligan and process them into grease. In 1988, the Haisla took 72 tons of Ooligan from the Camano River, or about 1.7 million of the small fish. On average, each Kitimat village family took 1/2 ton of fish per individual. Some of that is frozen or dried or smoked, but most is rendered into grease in a process that has changed little over the centuries. After netting as many Ooligan as is needed for the year's supply, the fish are taken to the camps and dumped in large holding pens where they sit for a week or so, depending on how warm it is. The Ooligan actually begin to rot. It may seem odd, but the wait is necessary for the process.
It's too fresh, you won't get as much oil out of it.
The next step is to boil the Ooligan. Large vats are filled with the fish and fresh water. A fire is built under the vats, and the mixture is boiled and stirred for several hours. As the mushy contents cool, the grease floats to the surface. Ooligan have an extremely high fat content. They're sometimes called candlefish, apparently because when dried out whole, one end of the fish can be lit like a candle. 1 ton of the fish will make about 15 gallons of grease. The grease is then skimmed off with small scoops and collected in 5-gallon pails. The process is very much like that practiced by the Nisga'a Indians in the Nass Valley, but the Haisla do one extra step that the Nisga'a don't. Fist-sized rocks are heated in a fire and then set into the pails of grease. The Haisla say this burns off any impurities in the grease and gives it an extra special shot of flavor. The grease is considered a delicacy by coastal Indians. The Haisla trade it with other bands for other seafoods, such as herring spawn on kelp. If it's sold, the price is in the neighborhood of $140 a gallon, although it's estimated the costs for production are about $250 a gallon. The Ooligan run in the Camano River is healthy. It's one of the biggest in the province, and the quality of the fish and the grease that is rendered is high. The Haisla catch about 10% of the run every year, which leaves plenty in the river for propagation of future stocks. Still, the natives are concerned about the Camano River Ooligan run. They don't want it to suffer the same fate as befell the Ooligan in the Kitimat River.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Thank you for staying with us. Oil, medicine, food, and trade items provided by Ooligans influence generations of Indigenous peoples. It could be said that Ooligan could be a keystone species of West Coast Indigenous culture. Since Ooligans runs occur when human food supplies historically ran low, some nations called them salvation fish. High in oils, up to 20% of the Ooligan mass is fat, and just 150 milliliters or 5 ounces provides half the adult human's daily energy needs. Let us return to the archives to discover what happens when industry arrives.
At one time, the Kitimat River was the main source of Ooligan for the Haisla, but that was before industrial development came to the area.
The run in the Kitimat River, of course, has been affected by the pollution from the industries that put, and the municipality, that put their effluent into the Kitimat River. I suppose it was heightened with the coming of Hurricane and the dumping of effluent directly into the river. And that in itself scared our people. It was good cause. I think you've heard of the dioxins, the other chemicals that are being, it's evident now that there's a lot more credibility to that scare than there ever was before.
The number of Ooligan in the Kitimat River has been significantly reduced over the years, and the Haisla say the fish that remain are not good to eat.
Some of the guys try to boil it. You can smell the pollution right away out of the ones in Kitimat.
And now the Haisla fear new industrial development in the Camano Valley will adversely impact the Ooligan in that river. Alcan has started work on its Camano completion project to increase the amount of electricity generated from its Camano power plant. Massive development, when finished, will increase the amount of water in the Camano River by up to 50% during March and April, the months the Ooligan enter the river to spawn. It's these increased flows and the corresponding jump in river velocity that worries the Haisla.
Well, I suppose at this point our specific concern is that the Camano River is perhaps the last reliable, untainted source of Ooligan that is available to our people. And if there is to be any change to the flows of that river, other than what's currently there, there's always a possibility that it's going to damage the run.
And you're concerned that the Camano completion project will affect the water flows in the Camano?
Of course, the water flows are going to be varied. We all know that. But what we don't know is the effect on the Ooligan, the estuary, and the other species of wild water life that is in the area.
While the Haisla fear for the future of the Ooligan because of the Camano completion project, Alcan is also concerned that its project not adversely impact the fish. The company feels it's necessary that the fears of the natives be taken into account and the possible effects of the increased water flows on the fish be carefully studied.
Well, yeah, of course it's necessary. I think that we committed in 1980 when we began to try to develop this project, and through the length of period of time that we've been working on it, the last 9 years, we committed to ensure that we were not disrupting our neighbors. And the Haisla people are our neighbors in this project. Our power line goes across their land. This river, the Camano River, is a large staple supplier of Ooligan, which is one of their staple foodstuffs. So it certainly behooves us to ensure that we're not doing anything that will affect their way of life.
In 1980, Alcan hired an environmental consulting firm to study the Camano River Ooligan and assess the impact the Camano completion project might have on the fish. That year, the company gathered biological data on the Ooligan, More information was gathered in 1988, and then again this spring. Biologists are trying to learn all they can about the fish, the routes they travel to the spawning beds, the location of those beds, how many fish return to spawn, the number of eggs they lay, and the type of gravel they prefer to spawn those eggs upon.
Now, back in 1980, Envirocon, on behalf of Alcan, conducted similar studies, but they were not done jointly with the natives. As a consequence of those studies in 1980, we concluded that with the increased flows in the project, that there would not be an impact on the Ooligan. Because of the resurrected concern associated with the KCP advancement, it was decided that we should go out and collect some new data jointly with the natives, and in essence to verify the conclusions that were reached in 1980.
Because Ooligan are not a commercially valuable fish in the way salmon or herring or halibut are, they've not been the subject of very much scientific study. Very little is known about their life cycle when they're at sea, and not a great deal is known about the fish when they return to the rivers to spawn. But the head of the environmental consulting company says enough is known to allow him to predict commando completion will not hurt the Ooligan run, even though river flows will jump between 40 and 50%.
But that increase in flow does not necessarily mean an increase in velocity, say, of an equal amount. The velocity increase will probably be about 15%. And that's an important parameter when you're looking at potential impacts on the Ooligan, because they like to migrate up the river along the slower water areas along the fringe of the river. So you want to be sure you have a clear reading on what the velocity changes will be so that you're confident there won't be an impact on their upstream migration. And that's the conclusion we've reached, that there will not be an impact on their upstream migration.
Now, how do you know that?
Well, the hydraulic theory in the river, you know how much water, additional water will be coming down the river. You know that what the channel configuration is, and there are mathematical formula that allow you to determine what the change in velocity will be.
So the change in velocity, 15%?
That's right, about 15, maybe 20 on the outside.
Now, how do you know that 15% isn't going to affect the Ooligan?
Well, we know, looking at hydraulic theory again, and the form of the body and the musculature of the fish, we have a good idea on what the range of the swimming speed is. In addition, from field observations, we know what range of velocities they track when they move up into the river. And no matter how much water you put in the river, you'll still have slow water areas, because they track the shoreline. So you're still going to have a shoreline even with the increased flow.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome back to Open Connection. Ooligan spend most of their life in the ocean, but like salmon, they return to freshwater streams and rivers to spawn and die. Unlike most salmon, however, Ooligan spawn in the spring and require river systems that have spring freshet, a sudden rise in the river as a result of rapidly melting snow and glacial ice. Let us return to the archives as Gerald Amos shares his concerns.
However, despite the claims of the environmental consultant, the people of Kitimat Village still have their doubts. They say they know of no other Ooligan-bearing river where the flows have been significantly increased, and so there's no yardstick with which to ascertain if water flow changes will impact the fish returns. They say they don't believe the consultant's assurances.
Personally, I don't. And I don't think if you find any other guys at this point who will believe it, simply because there's a cycle that the Ooligan follows, as with all other fish that come back to spawn. And it's interesting to note that in the project that's been ongoing for in the second year now, up in the Kimano River, one of the people working for Envirocon, I assume, made a statement that it's going to be at least another 3 or 4 years before we know for sure what the habits of the Ooligan is. So, given that statement, I think it's evident that there's uncertainty from both the scientific personnel up there and from our people who are the user group.
The Ooligan spend an average 6 or 7 years at sea before returning to the rivers to spawn. That means the natives have a valid concern when they say any impact on the spawning fish won't be known until years after the water flow changes are made. What happens if you're wrong? What happens if the returns are affected?
Well, that's a good question. I don't think that I am wrong, and we're very confident in our predictions. When you look at the number of fish that are spawning in this river, the estimates from 15 to 20 million fish, the natural fishery takes a small percentage of that, less than 10%, maybe 1.5, 2 million fish. So even if we were wrong by a factor of 50%, there are still more fish than are being taken by the fishery.
So you have some margin of error in there.
A large margin of error in terms of the number of fish that are being harvested versus the number of fish that are there, yes.
The Camano River today bears little resemblance to the river as it was 40 years ago. The Camano project of the 1950s increased water flows by 2,000%. That means 20 times more water is in the river now as there was before Alcan finished the first stage of its hydroelectric project. And yet today the Ooligan population is healthy. And Bruce Jenkins feels, if anything, the increased water levels have benefited the Ooligan and likely increased their numbers over what they were in 1950.
There's no hardcore environmental baseline data that allows you to make that comparison, but it's clear when you look at the river and look at the configuration of the channels that in fact the increase in flow is likely to improve the habitat availability, because the base flows in the Camano River without Camano 1 would be extremely low, 6 or 7, maybe 8 cubic meters per second. Now you're looking at over 100 cubic meters per second. With that increase in flow, you get a lot more side channels, quiet water areas, and a significant increase in the amount of spawning habitat. And in fact, our studies show that the fish move into these areas that would not have been there without the original power project. So it's clear to me that, in fact, Camano 1 had a beneficial effect on the Ooligan.
I think there's an inherent danger in that philosophy. It seems to me a lot of that there's people out there who are attempting to convince not just the Indians but the general population that the more the merrier, and that's not always the case.
The latest stage of the Camano project is scheduled for completion in 1994. That's when the water flows in the Camano River will increase. But with a 6-year spawn cycle for the Ooligan, it won't be until sometime after the year 2000 that scientists will know for certain the impact the increased water flows will have on the fish. And in the intervening years, Alcan officials say the company will do what it has to ensure its massive hydroelectric project and the Ooligan can coexist successfully.
I think environmental concerns, though, however, have been in the forefront of Alcan's developments wherever they've been. And we've always paid a great deal of attention to them. Like the rest of the world, British Columbia has emerged very strongly in favor of protection of the existing environment to the best of its ability, and Alcan is very much for that. And we are prepared to work and spend the additional monies that are necessary to ensure that we are not having a deleterious effect on the environment. Our employees enjoy this environment, and so does the company.
The people of Kitimat Village have a different perspective of their rights and of their powers than they did 40 years ago when Alcan first came to the Northwest. The Haisla are much more politically active, with the will to make their concerns known and the ability to have them taken seriously.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Steelhead are similar to other Pacific salmon in many ways, except for one glaring exception. They can be repeat spawners. Their classification is hotly debated. They used to be placed in the genus Salmo, but now most scientists place them in the Oncorhynchus genus, while others disagree because of the repeat spawning. In this final segment of Open Connection, Steelhead radio tagging.
Using an antenna and an electronic receiver, the fishermen are tracking their prey from a bank overlooking the river. They can't see the fish, but they know where some of them are.
It's downriver.
By pointing the antenna, the location of the fish can be almost pinpointed to a specific spot in the river, but the technique doesn't work for every fish. Only those that have been previously caught and force-fed a small transmitter that sends out an electronic signal.
As you point towards it, the signal will become audibly louder.
This radio tracking is not the latest weapon available to anglers to help increase their catch. It is rather being used in the pursuit of knowledge. The Steelhead Society is using the electronic steelhead to learn more about the migratory patterns of the fish.
Well, the idea of the whole program is to try and gain some information on actual winter run fish on the Copper River and what their movements are if they go above the canyon, and some of the ones that we've been getting, and that we've been going radio transmitter tagged here and goes out and spends a little time in the skeena, and then it comes back again.
The Steelhead Society is planting the transmitters in 16 steelhead over a period of several months. Some fish have already been tagged. Today, the two fishermen are heading to a good stretch of river, hoping to land a couple more of the prize sport fish, to tag them and implant the transmitters.
All the radio transmitted fish have 2 spaghetti tags, okay, 2 orange ones.
Each of the 16 radio transmitters sends out a signal, and each of the signals is different than the others. The receiver is then programmed to pick up the various frequencies emitted by each transmitter. That way, the tagged fish can be identified by its individual frequency. In tracking the fish after it's been tagged, the receiver scans the various signals until it picks one up and locks into it. The closer the fish is to the receiver, the louder the beep is that it emits. After the receiver's been programmed, the next step is to catch a fish, and that, of course, is not always a certainty. The Copper River was chosen for the radio tagging program for a couple of reasons. The river supports a sizable run of winter-run steelhead. Those are the fish that move into the river in the winter months in preparation for spawning in the spring. Summer-run steelhead, on the other hand, move into the rivers later in the year. Because of the winter-run steelhead, the Copper River receives a lot of angling pressure. It's one of the most heavily fished northwest rivers during the winter months. It's uncertain to what extent the angling pressure is affecting the run of winter steelhead. All but a few miles of the Copper River are closed to fishing during the winter, but by learning more about the steelhead, that restriction could be relaxed. Or conversely, the restrictions could be tightened if it's found that numbers of fish can't withstand the angling pressure.
Fish and Wildlife Branch, we've got several key streams in the area that are probably pretty popular with the sports fishermen as far as steelhead are concerned. It's Lake Elsa, Copper, and the Caleb, basically for the terrace area. And there's a lot of information we just don't know about the movements and the timing of these fish.
To call Mike Welpley and Stan Dahl fishing enthusiasts is an understatement. Fishing fanatics might be a better description. They love fishing, spend a lot of time doing it, and they do it well. Still, they work the Copper River for a couple of hours before finally striking a fish. The steelhead is quickly brought to shore so it doesn't dangerously tire itself in a prolonged battle. It is a winter-run fish in good condition, so it will receive a radio transmitter. But first, it's marked with a couple of spaghetti tags in its dorsal fin. This will readily identify it as a transmitter fish should it be caught again after it's released. The hooks used to capture the fish are barbless, but this fish has struck hard and driven the hook deep into its jaw, causing some difficulty in dislodging it. The radio transmitter is then inserted into the fish's stomach using a small pusher tube. Although this might cause the fish some initial discomfort, it apparently does not harm the animal. When at sea, steelhead routinely swallow food fish, such as herring, that are much larger than the transmitter. While the process is underway, it's important not to have the fish out of the water for too long, or it will weaken and may not survive after it's released.
78?
Finally, the fish is measured, and then it's let go. The transmitter in its stomach relaying a constant signal, which will help track the fish and determine its migration patterns.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Open Connection. The greatest distance in the existence of man is not from here to there, but the connection from his mind to his heart. If we can conquer that distance, we can soar like an eagle and realize our immensity within. I'm Robert Pictou.